running? Oh, thank you. Thank you. We're not up and running. Okay, you want me to stall for a second? You want me to tell some bad jokes? I could try to tell some jokes. I don't know if Lena is watching tonight, but have any of you met, do you know who Lena is? You guys know who Lena is? She's just a few years older than me. She's not too much older than me, but she sits here with um, with her son and daughter-in-law. The three of them sit here like on Thursday nights. Lena, she's in her 90s, and she is like a joke a minute. She's absolutely hilarious. Get her talking, ask her to tell you a joke, and she'll go on and on and on and on, tell you all kinds of jokes. So let me see if I can tell a joke that Lena would like. Um, I'm drawing blanks here. Uh-oh. Uh, so, so this lady dies prematurely, and she finds herself at heaven's gates, and there's Saint Peter waiting for her at the gates of heaven, and she says, "Is this heaven?" And he says, "Yes." And she says, "Wow, this is awesome." And Peter says, "Well, now wait a second. Before you can come in here, you got to pass a test." By the way, this is not theologically accurate, so don't go basing too much on this. And so Peter says, "You got to pass a test." And the woman says, "Well, what kind of test?" And he says, "It's a spelling test." And she's thinking, "Well, I did pretty good in spelling." And so she says, "What do you want me to spell?" And he says, "The word is love. I want you to spell love." And she goes, "Well, Love, love." And Peter goes, "Welcome, welcome to heaven. Come on in." And so, and she crosses into the gate and says, "Oh, you know what? I have to go on my break right now. Could you do me a favor and could you stand here at the gate and just kind of fill in for me while I go on my quick little coffee break, And there's a Starbucks around the corner when you get to heaven. Did you know that?" And so he had to go get his coffee break, and she said, "Well, what do I do?" And he says, "Well, you just do what I just did. You give a test where everybody that comes to the gates." And so she's standing there, and suddenly her husband appears, and she says, "Well, what are you doing here? How did you get here? What happened?" And he said, "Well, I was just so distraught. I was driving home from the hospital, and my eyes were so swollen with tears, and I went right off the edge of the road and had a crash, and I'm here." And she goes, "Wow. Well, I'm filling in for Peter here, and I can't let you in until you pass a test." And he goes, "Really? Okay, well, what's the test?" She says, "It's a spelling test." And he says to himself, "Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. And I'm not too good at spelling." And she said, and he says, "Okay, well, what do you want me to spell?" And she says, "Well, I want you to spell Czechoslovakia." You laughed almost as much as Lena did when I told her that joke. So are we ready to go up and up now? We don't even have control. Well, do I have control of my PowerPoint? He's got both computers. So Earl, would you please, can you try clicking on that screen? You should be able to have your mouse over there. No? Yeah. What was that about machines? The ghost in the machine. Yeah. The machines are rising up. There you go. See, we got it. Okay, so the day of Pentecost, the church is born. The Holy Spirit fills the believers. The apostles begin to preach about Jesus, and the church begins to grow, right? You remember all this. I'm doing this every week because I want to make sure that you're all up to speed. By chapter 7, the church began to experience persecution. Stephen is the first one to die for his faith. And one of the main men behind the persecution is this young man named Saul. But one day, while Saul is headed out for the city of Damascus to persecute the Christians there, he's knocked off of his horse by this bright light, and he meets Jesus. We know Saul by his Roman name, mostly in the book of Acts, because he is the one known as Paul the Apostle. And that's how he meets Jesus. By chapter 10, the gospel has gone to the most strangest people. It's gone to us pagan, pig dog, heathen Gentiles. Unclean, horrible, uncircumcised Gentiles. It starts with a man, a Roman centurion named Cornelius. And things begin to change in the church because up till Acts chapter 10, everybody who's born again is Jewish. The church couldn't even contemplate the idea that anybody other than Jews would be in heaven. That was just incomprehensible. They thought that Gentiles were nothing but the fuel for the fires of hell. That's how the fires keep going in hell, is because the Gentiles keep adding more Gentiles. Well, no, actually, Gentiles can get saved too. By chapter 13, we begin a new section in Acts as we begin to focus on the ministry of Paul. His first missionary journey starts at Antioch, goes through Cyprus to Galatia and back again. The second missionary journey, he goes from Antioch through Galatia up into Macedonia, Corinth, and then back to Jerusalem in Antioch. The third missionary journey goes up through here, up through Ephesus, Macedonia, Corinth, heads back through overland, back to Miletus, and that's where we ended last week. We haven't quite finished the third missionary journey. We're kind of wrapping it up tonight. He's back in Miletus saying goodbye to the Ephesian elders, where he had spent 3 years in Ephesus. And even though you could make a case that Ephesus is his favorite church because he spent the most time there, he's had the greatest effect, the greatest ministry in Ephesus, he still only gives them a few weeks, or actually not even a few days maybe, when he meets with the elders, because he's got places to go, people to see, things to do. He wants to get to Jerusalem by Passover. That's his goal. And so he only stays there for a little bit with the elders in Ephesus because he wants to get to Jerusalem. And something strange is happening. The closer he gets to Jerusalem, every place that he stops in Jerusalem, he meets with people who are Christians, and there are people there in each church who are prophets, and they all have this same message warning him that there's trouble ahead in Jerusalem. So we pick it up in chapter 21, starting in verse 1. Now it came to pass that when he had departed from them and set sail, running a straight course, we came to Cos, the following day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. Those are three names. The only one that we really know historically is the city which is on the island named Rhodes. Rhodes is famous as the location of this huge statue called the Colossus. We don't really know exactly what it looks like because it ain't there anymore. It's this huge statue, 100 feet tall. It straddled the harbor, we believe. The ships go in and out between the guy's legs. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world, just like that Ephesian amphitheater was not the Ephesian amphitheater. It was the temple of Diana, greatest Diana of the Ephesians. It was one of the 7 wonders. This is another one of the 7 wonders of the world. It only stood for about 50 years. It was destroyed by an earthquake in 226 BC, long before Paul arrives. But the remains of the statue apparently were laying on the ground up until 800 AD. So Paul would have seen the remains of this great Colossus. It was quite the tourist trap in Paul's day. And in fact, I wonder when Paul makes I don't know if it's like an overnight stop in Rhodes, I kind of wonder if this was what he looked like. He was dressed up in touristy stuff. I think he's got like when we were in Israel, we're all like totally major tourists. Okay, sorry, just had to do that. Verse 2. And finding a ship sailing over to Phoenicia, so they're switching ships, we went aboard and set sail. And when we had sighted Cyprus, we passed it on the left, sailed to Syria, and landed at Tyre, for there the ship was to unload her cargo. So let's go over this. So they're starting out at Miletus. They go then south around the island of Kos, and then they go further south this is where Rhodes is, the island of Rhodes, and there's a city. It sounds like they're launching it off of the beach is the way it sounds. They knelt down on the shore and they prayed together. And when we had taken our leave of one another, we boarded the ship, and they returned home. And when we had finished our voyage from Tyre, we came to Ptolemy and greeted the brethren and stayed with them for one day. Ptolemy is It's about 25 miles south of Tyre. It's on the coast. It's in the land of Israel. It's known today as the city of Akko, or back in Crusader days, it was known as Acre. It is. This is this is the bay. It kind of curves down like this, where down at this end is where Haifa and Mount Carmel is down here. But the top of it, the north end of it, is where the ancient city of Ptolemy, or known as Akko. It's a fun place to visit in Israel. It's like it's a Mediterranean place. It's fun. And you see a lot of ancient things, though most everything dates back to the days of the Crusaders, not all the way back to Paul's day. A lot of fun stuff in Akko. Verse 8. And on the next day, or Ptolemy, Akko and Ptolemy, on the next day, we who were Paul's companions departed and came to Caesarea and entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the seven, and stayed with him. Caesarea is another 30 miles further south of Ptolemy or Akko, and it's also on the coast. And so they make a little hop over to Caesarea, where they hook up with Philip the evangelist. Philip was one of the original 7 deacons way back in Acts chapter 6. That means he started off his ministry waiting on tables, serving the widows in the church. That's how he got his start, was waiting on tables in Jerusalem. He became known as evangelist because he traveled from Jerusalem up north to Samaria, where a whole revival breaks out in Samaria. And that's how he kind of got that nickname, the evangelist, because he was quite an evangelist. He went from there south to Gaza, where he found he met this Ethiopian eunuch. He leads him to the Lord, and then he moves up the coast and he settles in Caesarea, and he's been there now for a number of years. And he's been raising his family in Caesarea. Verse 9. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. Now it doesn't say this. I kind of wonder if maybe they also have a word from the Lord. By the way, Paul, we're in unanimous agreement. You got trouble ahead. I don't know. It doesn't say that. I do love how this man's family seems to be serving the Lord, because it is a sad thing when somebody's serving the Lord and the family doesn't come along. It's just a very sad thing. Not with Philip. It's very cool. 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. I love it. Verse 10. And as we stayed many days, a certain prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. A prophet named Agabus. We've met him already. We met him back in Acts chapter 11, back when Paul was hanging out in the city of Antioch up in Syria. Agabus had prophesied about a coming famine that was going to come worldwide and affect the church in Jerusalem. The famine had actually did show up. It came in AD 46. This is now AD 56. So this is, a long time ago. This is the guy that got things going with this famine. And if you recall, because of Agabus's prophecy, the churches around the world started collecting money and sending money to Jerusalem in advance of this famine, all because of what God had spoken through Agabus. I imagine when Agabus shows up, it's like an old friend for Paul. Man, I haven't seen you in years. I don't know if they had little secret handshakes, or something like that. I don't know. But I imagine it was just a glorious time for old Aggie to show up. Verse 11. And when he had come to us, he took Paul's belt, bound his own hands and feet, and said, Thus says the Holy Spirit, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. Shall bind the man who owns this belt. I imagine this getting a little old for Paul. It's like, tell me something I don't know. Every stop he's getting warned. To me, it reminded me a little bit of the story of what happens at the end of Elijah's time on earth before he's swept up in this chariot of fire. You can read about it in 2 Kings chapter 2. He and his sidekick Elisha are making their last rounds, visiting all of his places where he's got these schools of prophets raising up. And at each spot, these young prophets are coming out and saying to Elisha, do you know that this is the day that your master is going to be taken? And you're going to get the feeling with Elisha, it's getting a little old. It's like, shut up. I know. You don't have to tell me this. What do you think we're doing here? We're saying goodbye. He's saying goodbye to everybody. You kind of get the feeling that Elisha's a little bit bugged about it. I kind of wonder how this is hitting Paul. If you notice, the message from Agabus is a bit clearer than some of these other messages, because it's all about God simply warning him of what's ahead. Agabus doesn't say, don't go. Agabus just says, you're going to be bound, just like this belt is binding me. I would say that this kind of shows me that Agabus is a little more experienced when it comes to the things of the Lord. And he knows when to stop where God stops and not to keep adding on his own feelings into this thing. He simply gives the message. Verse 12. Now when we heard these things, both we and those from that place pleaded with him not to go up to Jerusalem. So it's these people that are surrounding Paul that love him, that don't want him to go to Jerusalem. And sometimes the people that are closest to us mean well. It's not like they're saying, all right, get the guy out of here. Good riddance. And it's nothing like that. They don't want him to go. Sometimes the people closest to us mean well. But sometimes if we're not careful, they can end up hindering what God wants to do. And Paul knows what God wants to do. Verse 13, then Paul answered, what do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. So when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, the will of the Lord be done. He says, what are you doing breaking my heart? I think the lesson here is that we need to be encouraging the courageous, not discouraging them. There are times when God calls people to do extraordinary things. We ought to be behind them, not dragging them. Gary, I imagine, when Brittany said, I want to go around the world to all these third world countries where you'll never see me for 11 months, and I want to do this. And I imagine you're thinking, are you nuts? But you got to encourage the courageous. Stand behind them. I think about, what was it? A couple months ago, Caleb went off to Kyrgyzstan. That's not exactly the most stable part of the world right now. It's pretty close to Ukraine, and it's right on the border of China. And I remember thinking, Caleb, you're leaving your wife and your babies, and you're going to this Kyrgyzstan place, and yet he was sending the stuff on Facebook of his adventures in Kyrgyzstan, and it was awesome. It was like reading the book of Acts. It was beautiful. And then, if you really want to get blown away, then Kimmy goes and does the same thing. She's in Kyrgyzstan right now. She and a couple other women from the Bible college. They're off visiting these same groups of, these little home groups of 10, 15, 20 people that are meeting in a couple of these places scattered across Kyrgyzstan, where they've started Calvary Chapels. And then the American pastor had to leave because of all the mess, that's going on. And so now these little fellowships are functioning all on their own, just like the book of Acts. And Kimmy's part of that now this week. It's awesome. Be praying for her this week. As well as we probably could pray for Brittany too, Probably wouldn't, she's starting in Romania this month. It is appropriate to speak up and to voice your concerns. But if the person is convinced that this is what God wants, At some point, you got to trust him into God's hands. We want to be kind of like, we want to, I think that's a great, I love that speech. We need to encourage the courageous. If you might feel like God's calling you to do something courageous and you're getting pressure from others, found a good quote from Hudson Taylor, who was a missionary to China in the 1800s. He says, it doesn't matter how great the pressure is. What really matters is where the pressure lies, whether it comes between you and God or whether it presses you nearer his heart. And I think that's good stuff. Are people pressuring you away from God, between you and God? Or are they pressing you, is the situation pressing you near to God's heart? Verse 15. And after these days in Caesarea, we packed and went up to Jerusalem. It's a 50-mile trip inland from Caesarea up into the hills into Jerusalem. It's a 50-mile journey. Could have been 2 days for them to do this. With all the major Jewish feasts like Passover, because he's here for Passover, Jews from around the world are going to be here. We saw that on the day of Pentecost, right? The Holy Spirit came and they were speaking in all these tongues, and people from around the world were hearing their own tongues from these Galileans. Well, this is one of the feasts, Passover. And so Jews from around the world are here, and that plays into the story. Verse 16, also some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us and brought with them a certain Mnason of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we were to lodge. So this fellow Mnason is from Cyprus, which happens to be the same place that Barnabas was from. Some people suggest that Mnason might have lived halfway between Caesarea and Jerusalem. It is a 50-mile journey. That's a bit long to travel in one day, especially if you're on foot. I don't know if you're on a horse, but verse 17, and when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. This James is the half-brother of Jesus, and he's the leader of the church in Jerusalem. We've already seen this back in chapter 15. Verse 19, when he had greeted them, when James greeted this group, when Paul greeted James and the elders, he told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry, the things which God had done. It's been about 3 years since Paul has been in Jerusalem. That was in Acts 18:22. And since that time, in the last 3 years, since he's been there to report what's gone on, the main work has been in Ephesus, where he has spent 3 years. And from Ephesus, the gospel has been spread all throughout Asia Minor, which you think of as modern Turkey. And if you recall some of these miracles, people being healed from his handkerchiefs, demons being cast out, all kinds of freaky, crazy things, and many, many people turning to the Lord. It says, he told them in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry, through his serving. We serve and God works. That's the best that we can ever do, is to learn to serve and let God do the rest. The real lasting work in people's lives isn't what you and I do. It isn't. The real lasting work in people's lives is what God does. It's not what you do. I get caught up in that. I get people coming to me and they want me to fix their life and to decide everything for them or whatever. And I get caught up in that, thinking that I can fix people's lives. I can't fix anybody's lives. Can you fix anybody's life? I can't fix anybody's lives. God can fix people's lives. I can just serve God. I can serve people and let God do the work. Keith Green used to have a song, just keep doing your best, pray that it's blessed, and Jesus takes care of the rest. I love that song. Jesus takes care of it. Paul himself had written, just a few months earlier than this to the Corinthians. He said, "Who then is Paul and who is Apollos but ministers through whom you believed as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase." This is fresh. He wrote this within the year to the Corinthians. This is fresh on his mind. I think a good measure of how much I believe this, that I serve and God works, I think a way of testing that. I mean, do you believe that? Do you believe that if you just serve, then God will work? Do you believe that? A good test of it is your prayer life. If I really believe that God's work in people's lives is the most important, then I ought to be talking to him a lot about people. Understand? God's work in their life is what's important. And God will use me serving, doing things, but he will really work through me praying. Hudson Taylor was known for his mission work in China 150 years ago. Before he went to China, he was training to be a doctor in a poor town called Drainside. I don't know where they got the name for that. Drainside. You live next to the drain. Drainside. This is from his biography, and it goes like this. Praying and answers to prayer, that became the passion of his life. He learned to move men through God by prayer. He asked no man for any material thing. He laid all needs before his Lord. That doctor he had worked for at Drainside had suggested to his young assistant, "Taylor, please do remind me that when it is time to pay your salary, I'm so busy, I'm quite likely to forget to pay you." And forget he did. But Taylor remembered that in China, he would have no one to ask anything of, only God. So he simply asked God to remind the doctor. Back in the 1800s, it didn't have them internet stuff. And if you wrote a letter, you'd be lucky if they got it in 6 or 8 or 10 months. So it's not going to do good to write your mission, give me money letter. It ain't going to work. When you go to China, buddy, you're on your own. You're on your own. 3 weeks later, the doctor remembered to pay him, but only after he had banked his money. Taylor was broke. It was Saturday. He had no money to pay his rent. He had no money for food. He prayed as he worked until 10 o'clock, glad he would not have to face his landlady. As he prepared to leave, the doctor surprised him. "What do you think? One of my patients has just come to pay his bill. He's one of my richest patients, and he could have paid me by check any time, yet there he is bringing in the money at 10 o'clock on Saturday night." Then he added, "By the way, Taylor, you might as well take these notes, these bank notes. I have no change, but I can give you the balance of your salary in a week. Good night." Taylor's prayers were answered. He could not only pay his rent, he had money in hand for weeks ahead. But more than that, he had proven again that God answers prayer and moves men, and he could go to China. I think a good test of how confident we are that it's God's work that we need, I think that's put to the test, gang, by our prayer life. How serious are you about praying? Verse 20. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. He's telling them all about the things that had happened in this last trip. They glorified the Lord, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law." Now, myriads of Jews. The word myriads means literally 10,000. So myriads of Jews, there's 10,000s of Jews have come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah over the last 20 years. The church has exploded from the first day of Pentecost when it was 3,000. Now there's tens of thousands of Jews believing. And it says they are all zealous for the law. all of the Jewish believers are very strong in thinking that they need to obey the law of Moses. These are Jewish believers. This right here in this verse, he's not talking about the unbelieving Jews. He's not talking about the unbelieving Pharisees. He's talking about Jewish men and women who have come to trust Christ. And they're all very strong in the law. Okay, are you with me so far? Verse 21. But they have been informed about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles, people that don't live in Israel, that you teach them to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. Now, so all of these myriads, tens of thousands of believing Jews have heard this story about Paul. They've heard that Paul's telling the Jews, not Gentiles, but the Jews that are out there in Greece and Asia Minor and stuff, he's telling them they don't need to follow Moses. Paul was concerned about how he might be received by the unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem. Just a few months prior to this, Paul wrote the book of Romans. We talked about that last week. He puts this in the book of Romans. This is like 2-3 months before this. This shows his state of mind coming into Jerusalem. He says, "Now I beg you, brethren," he's writing to the Romans, "I beg you, brethren, through the Lord Jesus Christ and through the love of the Spirit, that you strive together with me in prayers to God for me, that I may be delivered from those in Judea who do not believe, and that my service for Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints." He was bringing financial offerings to the people in Jerusalem. But he's worried about the unbelieving Jews in Judea. You following me so far? That's who he's worried about when he gets to Jerusalem. And these non-believing Jews had been speaking bad about Paul around town. The Jewish believers are soaking it all in. So see, when Paul shows up in Jerusalem, all of the unbelieving Jews are bad-mouthing Paul, saying he's doing all this horrible stuff, all the stuff against Moses, and all the believing Jews are listening to it and believing it. They're starting to take the side of the unbelievers against Paul the Apostle. That's kind of like, are you kidding me? They're saying that you are saying to forsake Moses, teaching them to literally apostatize from Moses. The issue is not about how the Gentile believers should behave. They were claiming that Paul was teaching Jewish believers to stop following the law of Moses. In fact, Paul taught just the opposite. For example, in 1 Corinthians, which he just wrote a few months back, he says, "And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law." Paul's not opposed to the law. Nowhere did Paul tell the Jews that it was wrong for them to practice their customs, as long as they don't trust in the ceremony or make their customs the test of fellowship. The ceremonies themselves weren't wrong. In fact, the ceremonies in the Old Testament are pictures of Jesus. There's nothing wrong with the ceremonies. But the ceremonies don't save anybody. It's only trusting Jesus that saves a person. There's a lesson here, gang. You need to be careful who you listen to. You need to be careful who you listen to. These Jewish believers are getting confused by the Jewish unbelievers. It's kind of like that news stuff. You will get twisted ideas of what's going on in the world depending on which news station you're watching. Do you know that? Do you know that? And right now, I'll bet you all have certain news stations that you think tell you the truth, and the other ones don't. And I got to tell you, everybody's got an agenda. Everybody's got an agenda. And I think sometimes I don't know that we even have a clue what really is going on. The stuff that's going on in Ukraine, I am so worried for the people of Ukraine, as well as very confused about how the world is looking at Russia right now. And you'll get, it's who you're listening to. Be careful who you listen to. Some people don't even make any sense when you listen to them, like this guy.
We are having some difficulty understanding some of the language of these bills is complicated. Let me read a section, and I want you to see if you can help me make sense of this. Here's what it says. This is in reference to Medicare hospital patients, and I quote, "For discharges occurring in fiscal years 2011-2012, the Secretary shall determine an applicable percentage increase for purposes of subparagraph A using a tenuous linear sliding scale ranging from 25% for low-volume hospitals with 200 or fewer discharges for individuals entitled to or enrolled for benefits under Part A in the fiscal year to 0% for low-volume hospitals with greater than 1,500 discharges of such individuals in the fiscal year." This seems complicated. Now, you say this is easy to understand.
Listen to the next guy.
In plain, simple layman's terms, what does that section mean?
The way I see it, it's changing that I guess really for both the audited and the recited. Now, you combine the two, and they're in line with what we've seen so far. I just don't find that to be that hard to follow.
Let me try another one.
All right.
Maybe that's really.
As a win, yeah.
Well, it could be clear to the audience than it is to me, but I'm going to read another one, and let's see if. All right, this is from the House bill. I'm going to quote from the House bill. It says, "The provisions of Section 2646 shall apply to group health insurance coverage in the same manner as such provisions apply to individual health insurance coverage, except that in any reference to Section 2742F is deemed a reference to Section 2712F." Now, that just seems like government gobbledygook to me, but you think that makes sense?
I wouldn't make it up. But I do want to say this. I used to. I don't need to anymore. But I've got to try. And again, when I say try, I'm talking about all of us. And when I say all of us, I mean some. Don't you think that what we have too, and I guess maybe that in itself is something?
You want to run that by me one more time?
I could hold it in the mirror and see if you could read it forward, but then you did what we have, and that I guess really has that to note. And I will say this for Madison County, that's the second time I've said that in 2 weeks.
You know, the guy's just pulling your leg because it's a silly guy. But you know what? Sometimes some of the people we listen to make about as much sense, but because we think that they're like a smarter or authoritative person, we just kind of go, and we just go along with what they're telling us, without understanding what they're saying. Some people we're talking to don't have it quite right. Two airheads are walking through the woods and come to a set of tracks. One airhead says that they're deer tracks. The other airhead says that they're moose tracks. They were still arguing when the train hit them. Some people actually will twist the truth, even if it's just a little. Proverbs 18:8 says, "The words of a talebearer," that's a person who twists things, "are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost body." Sometimes we like some of these things that people will say, and some of it's twisted, some of it's not true. Paul's going to get into a lot of trouble in about a week. And you know what's really, really sad? It was kind of hitting me this week in this passage. Part of what's roiling up the fire, what's fanning the flames, is the church itself. The believing Jews who are listening to the slander from the unbelieving Jews. I wonder how far it would have gotten if the believing Jews would have said, "Wait a minute, this is Paul the Apostle. Yeah, I got to check this out. I'm not going to listen to what you're saying. I'm going to go ask Paul." But they didn't. Instead, they swallowed all this silly stuff. So that's why we got to be careful. Got to be careful who you're listening to, friends. Verse 22. "What then? The assembly must certainly meet." This is James talking. The assembly, the church must certainly meet, "for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow." Now, he's talking about 4 men in the church in Jerusalem, 4 Jewish believing men who have taken one of these Nazirite vows. We've talked about this before. This comes from Numbers 6. And yes, the Nazirites are the long-haired guys. They would also swear off no grapes, no wine, and no touching dead bodies. But the whole idea is that for a period of time, you dedicate time as being set apart for God. I'm going to give you this special time. We saw that Paul's done this. Paul's done a Nazirite vow. And it's the idea about, I'm dedicating the next 6 months to you, God, something along those lines. Well, there's some special rituals that go on to this. And he says, well, there's 4 guys here who are just wrapping up their special time. He says, verse 24, he says, take them and be purified with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. That's the Nazirite thing, because they're done, so they shave their heads. And that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. He says, pay their expenses. When a person's Nazirite vow, see, it could be a lifelong thing. Samson was supposed to be a lifelong thing. Some of them are lifelong vows. But some of it could be, I'm just going to give you the next 6 months, God, something like that. I'm going to give you the next year or something like that. And when the vow is completed, there's certain rituals and costs involved. It can be kind of expensive, especially if this is for 4 men. And it seems that Paul's being included on this. He says, for these 4 men as well as yourself. Some have suggested that when Paul made the vow back in Cenchrea, which is when he's coming out of Corinth, which got started on this whole thing, that maybe that's when he actually started the vow instead of when he finished his vow. That maybe he was cutting his hair so that from that point on until he gets to Jerusalem, he's just letting his hair grow. And if so, number 6 tells us what the price is. This is the law of the Nazirite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he shall be brought to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. He shall present his offering to the Lord. Here's the offering. For each person, 1 male lamb in its first year without blemish as a burnt offering, 1 ewe lamb in its first year without blemish as a sin offering, 1 ram without blemish as a peace offering, a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed with oil, and their grain offering with their drink offerings. I mean, he's a whole freaking barbecue for one guy. And he's supposed to do it probably times 5. So this is going to be it's going to cost a few coin here. I mean, that's quite an expensive thing. And the advice is meant to show the Jewish believers in Jerusalem, look, Paul is just as Jewish as you are. What are you worried about, Paul? Now, you could look at this and think, well, is this forcing Paul to be hypocritical? Not at all. Because we've already seen that Paul himself has taken vows at times. So there's nothing hypocritical about this at all. He's not pretending to be something that he's not already. He is a man who follows. Why did he want to go to Jerusalem at the Passover in the first place? Because he's a good Jewish boy. That's what good Jewish boys do, is they go to Jerusalem for the feasts. So, verse 25. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, because people are getting confused between what's going on in the Jews versus the Gentiles. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing. They don't have to follow the laws of Moses, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. We talked about all this back in Acts chapter 15. This was some 6 years prior when the church had made this decision. That good Jewish boys and girls, yeah, they're going to keep the law. But as pagan pig dog Gentiles, we don't have to keep the law because we're Gentiles. And so we are not under the law. Verse 26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. He's kind of giving notice to the priests of what's up ahead. It's kind of like you make your appointment. It's like making a doctor's appointment, but you're making an appointment. It's like you're going to go to the butcher, and you're going to say, well, in 7 days, I got a sacrifice for you guys to do for me and these 4 other guys. So he's just getting written in their appointment book. It's going to be 7 days from this point is when they're going to bring all these animals. Verse 27, now when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. Now, so the 7 days, the ritual took a week, this purification thing. And it says the Jews from Asia. This is probably more specifically the Jews from Ephesus, because that's the center of Asia. And that's where he spent the most time. That's where people know him. Remember, at Passover, people are coming from all around the world. And it was just a few months, maybe 6 months ago, when we had that huge riot in Acts chapter 19 in Ephesus, where Paul had to flee for his life. That was like 6 months ago. And he made the rounds to Macedonia and then to Corinth and then back to Macedonia and then back through Ephesus and all like that. It was like 6 months ago. The whole city knew Paul's name. And the Jews weren't happy about it either, because they were getting caught up in what these Christians were doing. And now these Jews, unbelieving Jews from Asia, from Ephesus, are going to be at the center of what's going to cause trouble. And they grabbed Paul, verse 28, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. Now, previously had seen Trophimus. Trophimus was one of Paul's traveling companions. We saw that last week in chapter 20. He's one of that entourage of the guys, remember, from all around, that he's gathered guys from all around in all his different places. Trophimus is the guy from Ephesus. And one day, these Ephesian Jews are watching Paul and Trophimus shopping, for a leg of lamb or something, in the marketplace. And they're seeing them together, and they're putting 1 and 2, 1 and 1 is equals 5. We see Paul. We see him in the temple. We've seen Paul with Trophimus. We know Trophimus is one of them big dog heathen Gentiles. He must have taken him into the temple. I'll bet that Paul did that. I'll bet he took him into the temple. Now, even if Paul had done this, it's actually not a completely unlawful thing. It depends where he took him. It is lawful for a Jew to be in one of the courts of the Gentile. It's lawful for a Gentile to be in the courts of the Gentiles. When you come into this is the north, this is the south, this is the east, and this is the west. The main gates are here. You go up the steps, it's called the southern steps, and there's these stairways up through the wall that come into the courtyard. And you can walk, as a Gentile, you can walk all around here, you can walk around here and around here. Any Gentile can come that far into the courtyard. Where they're not allowed is the temple proper, which is, if I take it back, first there's the court of women, then there's the court of Israel, which is for Jewish men, and then there's the court of the priests. And so it's like fewer and fewer people can go through each courtyard. And so as a Gentile, he's not allowed through there, and that's the truth. There was a short wall. It doesn't really show. Well, I guess maybe that's what this is here. There's a short wall. It was like 3 feet high. That's around the temple proper, and there was a sign on it that said, "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the sanctuary and enclosure. Anyone who is caught so doing will have himself to blame for his ensuing death." So they were assuming that Paul had taken Trophimus right past that sign. That's what they're saying. You got to be careful about judging too quickly. Sometimes we just don't care for certain people, and we are quick to assume that everything they do is wrong. Problem is, sometimes I'm wrong. God taught the people what to do about serious things. He says, "Then you shall inquire, search out, ask diligently. And if it is indeed true and certain that such an abomination was committed to you, then you follow through." But you got to find out. You got to find out. Proverbs 18:13. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. I love that proverb. It's the idea is that if you think you've figured something out and you haven't heard it, the whole thing, you're a fool. Because you may be, Well, there's a rookie police officer who was assigned to ride in a cruiser with an experienced partner. The call came over the car's radio telling them to disperse some people who were loitering. The officers drove to the street and observed a small crowd standing on a corner. The rookie rolls down his window and he says, "Let's get off the corner." No one moved. So he barked again. He said, "Let's get off the corner." Intimidated, the group of people began to kind of leave, and they're looking very puzzling at him. Proud of his first official act, the young policeman turns to his partner and says, "Well, how did I do?" "Well," partner says, "pretty good, especially since this was the bus stop." Wow, I thought that was better than that. Some of you are giving me little sympathetic chuckles just because you feel sorry because I'm dying up here. You know, sometimes we judge things a bit too quickly. Got to find out the facts first. Verse 30, "And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now, as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar." His name is Claudius Lysias. We'll see that in a couple chapters. When King Herod was refurbishing this temple area, he added a fort. It's called the Fortress of Antonio. That's where the Roman garrison was kept. Was in this building here, and it was built taller than the temple, so that up in the towers, the soldiers could look into the temple and see what was going on without actually putting their pig dog heathen Gentile boots into the temple and causing even bigger trouble. But they could keep an eye on things this way. Well, that they're watching what's happening. And so verse 32, "He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul." It says he brought centurions. A centurion is over 100 soldiers. So because it's plural, there's at least 200 Roman soldiers coming into the temple right now. "And then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains." This is Paul. "And he asked who he was and what he had done." Probably a chain on each arm, each chain linked to a Roman soldier. "And some among the crowd cried one thing, some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks, back into the Antonia fortress. When he reached the stairs," let me see if I can find that picture. The stairs, there was a set of stairs right here. And so the crowd is following them, probably out, there's gates here, out here, and they're going up to the stairs. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. You know, some people do, what do they call it? Crowd surfing? You know, rock concerts when they crowd diving, or that's what's happened with Paul, except it's the soldiers that are carrying him because everybody's out to kill him. "For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, 'Away with him!'" Verse 37. Verse 37, there we go. "Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, 'May I speak to you?' He replied, 'Can you speak Greek?' Because he's speaking to him in Greek. 'Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins into the wilderness?'" Now, the Jewish historian Josephus writes about this fellow. He's the head of the Sicarii, the assassins, people that carry this little dagger. And Luke says there was 4,000 of them. Josephus writes that there was 30,000 of them. He was an Egyptian impostor. I found a picture of him. There he is. He claimed to be a prophet, and he led this huge group to the Mount of Olives, promising his followers that the walls of Jerusalem were going to collapse at his command. And when they showed up, the Roman army promptly marched on them, killed some of them, captured some of them, and the rest were scattered, and the Egyptian escaped. That happened 2 years before this. And so when this riot starts happening, the Roman soldiers think, "This has got to be the Egyptian. The Egyptian is back." They think they're arresting a terrorist. But the Egyptian doesn't speak Greek, so they're very confused, very confused. Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people. He says, God, I got credentials. Tarsus is the capital of Cilicia, a well-respected city, had a reputation of education. That's how he's speaking Greek. So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs, motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying, so Paul's at the stairs of the Antonia Fortress. He's gonna say a few words to the crowd, and we get that next week. So with that, let's stand, let's pray.